Hello, podcast fam. I am thrilled to share some exciting news. My book, Sow, Grow, Lead, is officially live on Amazon. This book is more than just my story of starting a nonprofit and building a peanut butter factory in Malawi. So trust me, the ups and downs of that journey are worth the read. It's also packed with practical strategies to help nonprofit leaders like you tackle challenges with clarity, courage, and a whole lot of heart. If you've ever wondered how to turn your vision into reality, navigate the inevitable hurdles, and build something meaningful, whether in your organization or in your own life, this book is for you. I'd be so grateful for your support in spreading the word. Grab your copy of Sow, Grow, Lead in the show notes and on Amazon today. Let's keep sowing seeds of impact together. Are you a nonprofit professional who's feeling overwhelmed and burnt out? Well, welcome to the Lead with Heart podcast. I am your host, Haley Cooper. On this podcast, we will share stories of leadership, courage, and empathy that'll help you learn to take care of yourself, your staff, organization, and community. You will hear from nonprofit leaders who have been in your shoes and have learned best practices to raise more revenue and make a greater impact. Let's thrive together. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Lead with Heart podcast. This is your host, Haley Cooper. And right now I'm having a total pinch me moment because I have Darian Rodriguez Heyman on the podcast. I'm so excited to interview him. He has a lot that you'll learn in his bio that he has done in his career. But one of the things that has really impacted my fundraising career is his nonprofit fundraising 101 handbook. And I literally was telling him that I reference it all the time. And so a lot of his work has been foundational in my career. So I'm just so excited to welcome you to this podcast.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
So I always love to start the conversation with, I think a lot of people fall into nonprofits, fundraising. So I'd love to know a little bit more about your background and how you got into the nonprofit field.
Yeah, so I'm a bit of a dot-com refugee. Even though I dropped out engineering to become a teacher, life took some twists and turns, and I wound up starting a company right out of college with some of my college buddies that turned out to be one of the first digital ad agencies in the mid to late 90s. And that company exploded. We took it globally into over 20 countries, had 22 married couples come out of the company. So it was very much a family. But after the bubble burst and we had sold the company, it stopped being as much fun once I had to lay off my roommates and best friends. And so I went on what turned out to be my first of 3 6-month sabbaticals between careers. And while I was traveling, that was also when September 11th happened. I basically made a very firm decision that I was done focusing my career on making money for myself and other people. And I wanted to devote my work to philanthropy and social impact. And that's the work I've been doing for the last 20, 25 years. And I had a background in sales and business development, so that naturally translated to fundraising. But I think even more than that is when I first really running the foundation for Craigslist was my first big gig in the space. And I produced something called Nonprofit Bootcamp that within a year became the largest nonprofit gathering in Bay Area history. That led to the Nonprofit Management 101 book project. But basically, as I started to do a deep dive into the nonprofit landscape, I discovered that at the time, half of executive directors were leaving not only their job, but the sector within 5 years. And the number one reason was struggles with fundraising. And number two was frustrations with their board. In my experience, when you put the two together and you look at getting your board to fundraise, it can be incredibly vexing for many nonprofits. So I really decided that's what was needed. The same report also found that executive coaching was the number one most cost-effective solution. And so that led to a good chunk of my work on the coaching side. And then it's been 20 years since, just working with a lot of great causes and people.
I love that. Well, thank you so much for sharing your background and how you really had that moment of shift where you really wanted to make an impact and give back. And I think so many people can relate to that. And you were mentioning when you were doing this work and doing the research that people were leaving the sector. And I think that is still true today. A lot of people I'm talking about are just burnt out. They're stressed out. They don't know how to pave a way forward. And so they're leaving the sector. But we need nonprofit people because those are the people that are changing the world. So how do you help nonprofit leaders, executive directors navigate that in terms of managing their stress, managing their board, and being able to facilitate an organization that can fundraise successfully?
Yeah, there's a few different pieces to it, Haley. What I would say is there's at the most upstream point, I feel like we as a sector, especially as it relates to fundraising, we have a huge obstacle, a huge bottleneck that is impeding our ability to raise vastly more money and feel better about it and leave our donors feeling better about it. And there's actually a really short story that sort of illuminates this, the begging for alms and tin cup approach to fundraising that so many people, it's the reason why they don't want to do fundraising. And it's a story of a man who'd go on to become a renowned celebrity and philanthropist. But when he was young, he was the first in his family to go through college, actually went and got his master's. And while he was in the process of doing that, he was in a philosophy class where his professor got up in front of 200 master's and doctorate students, held up a glass of water and said, "Class, is this glass half full or half empty?" And these philosophy students talked in circles for an hour and a half, didn't solve the age-old riddle. And as he walked home really frustrated, his grandma, Gertrude, was there waiting for him. And she asked him how class was today. And he blew her off, but she pressed him, as grandmas are prone to do. "No, really, I want to know." And so he said, "Well, it was really frustrating if you got to know. We had 200 master's and doctorate students sitting around for an hour and a half talking in circles about if the glass is half full or half empty." And his grandma, without missing a beat, with all of a second grade education, mind you, said, "Oh, well, that's easy. It depends on whether you're pouring or drinking." Pouring or drinking. And the point and the connection of fundraising is that when we take this begging for alms mentality and approach, it's rooted in this misconstrued notion that we are the drinkers. And ultimately, financially speaking, we do rely on the charitable contributions of people and organizations to do our work. But fundamentally, nothing could be further from the truth because we are not the drinkers. We are the pourers. We are the nurturers of society. And fundamentally, what we do as a global movement with a capital M is we connect people and organizations with resources to the change they want to see in the world. And to me, that's sacred work. And it's a privilege to be able to do that. And we need to hold our heads high. And when you do fundraising correctly, it's less about holding out the tin cup and making an ask and more about throwing the party and inviting people to it. And hey, we're going to climb this hill. Who's with us? And if somebody or an organization shares your goals and shares your dreams of the community we want to build for tomorrow, they will gladly join on and they'll be thanking you for the opportunity. And that at its core, I think, is really the biggest obstacle I see. But then there's also a lot of tactical mistakes and pitfalls that I see a lot of emerging leaders fall into. And I feel like there's a lot of abstract concepts and theories out there and not enough tactical, practical tips and tools. Do this, don't do that. Here's how to. And so that's really become the foundation of my work in the sector ever since.
I love that story. And I just want to take a pause and just reflect on it because I think it is so powerful. And it really does change the narrative on how we approach fundraising and how we approach leadership. And so just thank you so much for sharing that story. And I would love to talk a little bit more about how I'm a fundraiser. I'm also a nonprofit consultant and coach, and I get calls from executive directors all the time being like, my board isn't fundraising. Why aren't they fundraising? And you know what I found is it's not a lack of fundraising, it's a lack of engagement to each other and the mission. They don't understand what they're doing. And they also get that idea of, well, I have to ask for money. That's scary. But obviously, we all know there's so many different aspects of fundraising. And like you said, it's not like taking money, it's with a purpose. So, how do you? I have my own approach on how I navigate. I don't really do fundraising trainings anymore because I don't need to tell someone how to ask for money. It's more about emotional connection and engagement. So how do you navigate those conversations where executive directors are just fed up, long story short, fed up and frustrated, and they're like, my board's not fundraising?
Yeah, that's probably the most common consulting work that I do is focus on board development and fundraising. So I think first and foremost, it's really critical to recognize all too often when I talk to executive directors and I hear the same question, they feel like it's the board's job to fundraise and that they should just make that happen magically, show up with big bags of money and set them on the CEO's desk. And It doesn't work that way. These are volunteers that need to be led. You need to help them help you and provide them with the tools, with the training, with the expertise to be able to help support fundraising. And that starts with being really explicit and upfront about what exactly is the board's role in fundraising. And all too often, this goes unsaid. And so the board doesn't recognize that's a critical part of its role. And how are they supposed to know that if you don't tell them and set expectations and provide that training and materials? So typically in the form of a board member agreement, which is a really simple 2 or 3 page document that in very plain language, black and white terms, just lays out what are the minimum expectations of all board members, including fundraising, but also participating in meetings and committees and showing up to an event once a year to keep your fingers on the pulse of the mission. Whatever else it might be, put it on a piece of paper, have them sign it, and actually have the board decide what goes on that piece of paper so that you're not forcing these expectations on them and moving the goalposts from what they originally signed on to, but it's a board-led transition that needs to be graceful. And really where I see this happen the most is when a board is essentially trying to evolve from what I would call a working board, where the small group, the board is essentially an extension of the staff, to you punch through $500,000, $1 million a year in revenue. Now you actually have a staff doing the day-to-day work, and the needs of the board evolve. And there has to be a conversation that should be exciting. It should sound something like, thank you so much for all your hard work and leadership and tireless commitment. Because of you, we are now at this exciting inflection point where we're going to add a zero to our revenues, where we're going to start serving a lot more people. And it probably makes sense for us to revisit the highest and the best purpose of the board in this next chapter. And boards, if you frame it that way, always are excited about that. And if you talk to them about implementing a suite of tools, including a board member agreement that serve to create more accountability and transparency so that we can unlock a board where everybody knows exactly what's expected of them and how the pieces fit together, where we take a much more intentional and proactive approach to board recruitment and refinement, and where we make infinitely better use of the board's time in meetings. And so instead of just talking at them and giving them a bunch of FYIs and updates, we actually get those out of the way in the first 5 or 10 minutes of the board meeting so we can spend our time in dialogue, in problem solving and brainstorming and moving the mission forward in ways that the executive director didn't already have these answers and these ideas before the meeting. And that's the juice. That's the magic that you get from the board. And lo and behold, when board members are able to contribute in that strategic way, they automatically and organically have a much deeper sense of connection to the mission, which directly translates into expanded fundraising and contributions.
Imagine a fundraising partner that not only helps you raise more money, but also supports you in retaining your donors. A partner that helps you raise funds both online and on location so you can grow your impact faster. That's DonorBox, a comprehensive suite of tools, services, and resources that give fundraisers just like you a custom solution to tackle your unique challenges, helping you achieve the growth and sustainability your organization needs, helping you help others. Visit donorbox.org to learn more. Yes, I love that. And I want to dive a little bit deeper into, I think I've been on board meetings. I've been in meetings that are very ineffective, and either people are talking in circles or nothing's getting moved forward. People don't feel seen and heard. And so there's always a few people that are speaking up, other ones that are quiet or being called out on. And I know there's like specific like Robert rules to follow a board meeting, but how have you found to, as an executive director or board chair, to navigate effective meetings? What are some strategies that you coach people on to really, like, people, you have to value their time and you want to make it more strategic because that's the point of the board. So how do you navigate that and making sure people are there for a purpose and leave with a purpose?
Yeah, I think this is absolutely critical. And the mantra that I come back to all the time when I do work with boards is low touch, high value. You essentially want to treat your board like heads of state. Like, these are busy, high powered people. It is incumbent upon the staff to help your board have a transformational impact on the organization and on its mission with a handful of hours a month of their time.
Mhm.
And meetings is probably the single biggest time suck and waste of energy in the context of that, to your point. And as I shared earlier, all too often, we spend 90% of our time in monologue just bringing them up to speed. So supposedly they can be effective ambassadors. And in my experience, the absolutely right way to do this and the sort of transformational tool that I've helped lots of groups implement is called a consent agenda or a docket agenda. And it's actually a three-part tool that includes an organizational dashboard, executive summaries, and streamlined minutes. So it's
Hmm.
like a sandwich that you send out as one integrated PDF before the meeting, along with the agenda. And then your first order of business at the meeting is to literally sit there in silence as people read or hopefully reread this short packet. And as soon as they're done with that, which takes about 4 or 5 minutes, like they are up to speed on everything they absolutely need to know. And so all of our time is freed up to get into dialogue, problem solving, and the like. And just to say a little bit more about those three components, the organizational dashboard is the first page of the packet. It's a one-page sort of heads up display, just like when you sit in your car and you know if you're going to run out of gas or overheat. Well, you need the same thing for your organization. And so the idea is, and this is a tool that's pretty common in the for-profit landscape, but you identify a series of metrics or key performance indicators for each of which, and they represent not only financial and operational health, but programmatic impact. We're mission-led organizations, so we need to know how many beds have we filled with homeless or how many meals have we served, et cetera. And so the idea is you identify about a dozen metrics that are your North Star indicators. And for each of those, you're reporting not just against an annual target, but a year-to-date target, which means you have to set month by month targets for each metric. But you want to know not that we're at 13% of our annual target, but we're at 102% of our revenue goal for this point in time. It's good, right? 13%, who knows? So that's the first piece, which is really helpful. And at a glance, they know how things are going. The second piece, and you've got green, yellow, red indicators there. So if everything's blinking green, steady as she goes. The meat of the sandwich are those executive summaries. And this is where any agenda item, with very few exceptions, that has the word report or update in it, it does not belong on your agenda. It belongs in the sandwich. It belongs in these executive summaries. And the key thing, again, going back to treating your board like heads of state, is that each of these updates is no more than 2 paragraphs each. So it's a fundraising update, a financial update, a program one update, program two update, facilities update, board recruitment update, whatever FYIs you want to download to the board, put them in writing, keep them super, super short. It's like the Cliff Notes version. And don't just tell them the what, tell them the so what. Don't just tell them we've hit our revenue target, tell them why we were successful. Is there anything they need to know about that? Oh, we're short on our grant target this month. Is that a problem? What are we doing about it? So in short order. And then finally, the minutes. And oftentimes I'll see minutes that are 10 pages long with he said, she said, and what time the meeting adjourned and who was present. You can keep that for archival purposes. But for as far as a management tool, it's 2 to 3 pages. And really, you're only focusing those minutes on three things. One is any key takeaways or insights that were unearthed in the last meeting. Two is any votes that were taken. I like to literally just bold and italicize those so they jump off the page. And three, and this is the most important and will become increasingly important as you use this tool, are any action items or commitments that were made, right? Darian offered to call this donor and invite him out to lunch next week. The entire finance committee committed to sending out updated financials by the end of the month. And everyone on the board agreed to make 3 calls to gala attendees this week, whatever it might be, but each person or group reference gets their own highlighter color. So I know I can just look for anything that's highlighted in purple, red, and green because that relates to me, my role on the finance committee, and my role as a board member at large. And all of a sudden, I've got a really clear record of my homework. And if I am about to show up to that meeting and miss one of those, it's pretty easy for me to jump on and take care of it. So to me, that tool, I've seen it just be ball bearings for good governance. And like I said, it's almost like if you saw the movie The Matrix and how he learns Kung Fu in 5 seconds. This is your board Kung Fu. You get it out of the way in 5-10 minutes max. And now we're freed up to get into the real juicy discussions.
Ooh, that's so good. I've never heard of it's the sandwich, the agenda sandwich, but I like that. I'm going to have to do a little bit more research on that as I sit on a few boards and lead a board and
no
how to
problem.
navigate those conversations. I love that strategy.
Yeah, I also have some templates for these. So if you or any of your listeners want to reach out to me, I'm happy to share a template for the consent agenda, the board member agreement I mentioned before, and I also have a template for the board matrix tool, which is how you really invite intentionality into board recruitment and retention.
Yeah, we can always link it to it in the show notes as well. I wanted to shift gears a little bit because I know that you wrote the book Nonprofit Management. And at least what I've seen a lot or have heard a lot in my own experience as a nonprofit leader is a lot of people are trained as managers and not leaders, and there is a
Hmm.
distinction. And so I would love your insight into how a lot of people want to leave organizations because they have managers and they want a leader. And so how do you define the two, and how do you help leaders lead well?
Yeah, the simplest and best way I've heard it said is that good managers direct and good leaders inspire,
Hmm.
right? So it's the difference between motivate and inspire, basically. And that leadership you're talking about is about crafting a vision that is compelling and that is needed, and then building support around and for it. And that's what ultimately leadership is about. Management is more about delegation and getting things done. And the two are equally important, but you really can't have one without the other if you're going to have a thriving organization. And I think, again, when it comes down to it, I feel like there's a lot of big abstract concepts, theories, philosophies that are out there. And in my experience, it's really on the managerial tools. There's a lot of very solid leaders and visionaries in this space, but how do you actually achieve that vision and make it manifest? And ultimately, this sector is incredibly fragmented, right? You would never see a business plan in the for profit sector without a competitive analysis. But most nonprofits get started without having taken the time to survey the landscape, see who else is out there and how their work is different. And so it's really helpful to know, first of all, what is unique about your approach, and then ultimately to have access to a variety of different tactics, tips, tools. Do this, don't do that, here's how to. And that kind of knowledge, whether it's around getting your board to fundraise, whether it's around grant writing or major gifts or whatever it may be, there's some right ways to do this. So there's 1.8 million nonprofits in the country, and we've been at this for centuries. And all too often, I find that nonprofits are busy reinventing the wheel. And so
Hmm.
in my experience, about finding those best practices and the real tactical considerations and disseminating those in a bit of a prescriptive way. I have a kind of a unique approach to my coaching work where instead of just asking you questions to help you tease out your inner truth, to me, it's about providing clear direction of do this, don't do that, here's how to. And you might not follow my advice, but you're never going to wonder what I'm thinking. And I find it to be really helpful to have someone who's been down the road before you and knows where those potholes are and how to sidestep them.
Yeah, I definitely think that's helpful. And I've had executive coaches my whole career or mentors. And that's one thing. It's helpful to have both one where you find that inner truth, but once you do, someone to give you those steps to follow and guide you in the right direction. And, another pain point that I've seen, and I don't know if you have heard this as well, but I know in your work you help build the capacity of leaders, and a lot of nonprofits and nonprofit professionals leave the sector because they don't feel like they have professional development, or
Mm.
there's not that upward trajectory within an organization that you generally see in the for-profit space. And so how do you help guide leaders to build their own capacity, but build the capacity within the people within the organization? Because I always talk about how high cost turnover is high cost fundraising. And so if you're not building up your people, you're losing them, and then you're losing your donor relationships. And so by investing in them in the first place, it actually has that return on investment that you want. And so how do you navigate those conversations where people are like, well, we don't have the budget, but we know you need to invest in it? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think we have a leaky pipeline problem. I've heard people talking about the need to expand the pipeline of nonprofit leaders and get more youth and emerging leaders into the sector. But the study you're referring to back 20 years ago found that fully half of executive directors leave not only their job, but the sector within 5 years. And the number one reason is frustrations around fundraising. And number two is challenges with their board. And like we were just talking about, if you put the two together, that can be really vexing for many groups. I think that there's a lot of compassion fatigue in the space. And just by nature of the fact that we're working in the nonprofit world, people feel like anything they do for themselves is taking away from the clients. And we need to recognize that this work is not a sprint, it's a marathon. And if you're not willing to take care of yourself for your own good, do it for the clients that you serve. Because if you don't, you're not going to be able to sustain this work. And I also think from a sort of internal culture standpoint, there can be a bit of the churn and burn you're talking about, getting underpaid and overworked, because almost every nonprofit I've worked with has a mission that's way larger than their capacity and their resource base. And so there's always this dynamic of really stretching things to get as much done as possible. So to me, I think a lot of it, and my focus is really on working smarter, not harder, and having some of these tactics and tools in place so that you can get more done. I'm really excited from a fundraising perspective about the potential for AI to be disruptive and to essentially be like a new admin on your fundraising team, especially because no matter how advanced the technology gets, it's never going to replace the critical fundamental value of human relationships. And whether you're raising from foundations or companies or individuals, that's the basis of everything we do. And so freeing up development staff so they can spend more time building those relationships and strengthening those partnerships, being in touch when they're not just asking for money, but really stewarding those critical partnerships, all of that is absolutely critical.
Yeah, and I think that goes back to when you're talking about the dashboard and the metrics, being able to include some of those as well, because I know that I've been based on a revenue status, but obviously there's so much more that goes into just getting that dollar goal. And so I think, yeah, like you said, opening up those opportunities for fundraisers to be able to do their job in multiple different ways.
Yeah.
And
You were talking about the Nonprofit Fundraising 101 book. And what's interesting is, I interviewed some of the top nonprofit fundraising experts across about 35 different disciplines. And there's one thing I heard in every single interview, whether it was for direct mail, foundations, corporate, major donors, online, you name it, which is that nobody wants to be treated like an ATM. And I think all too often, because we're under-resourced and understaffed in this sector, we're only in contact with these folks when we need money. And that doesn't feel good and it's not as effective. And in the for-profit world, they talk about how it's 7 times as expensive to acquire new customers to maintain one. Kay Sprinkle Grace, one of my fundraising mentors and Shiros, shared that it's 11 times as expensive to replace a donor. So it's even more critical for us to maintain and steward those relationships. And the golden standard, if it's possible, is to try to map out 7 touch points between each ask, so that you're building that relationship. You're sharing an impact update or just a newsletter or a little one-liner to let you know you're thinking of them. Or you actually go to them when you have a challenge or a question and you don't know the answer. The smartest thing I've ever heard about fundraising is if you want money, ask for advice. And if you want advice, ask for money. So get these folks engaged in the mission. And I think that can be really powerful. And one specific tactic in the context of that is I once heard a stat from Bloomerang that if a new donor receives a thank you call from a board member within 2 days, within 48 hours of their first gift, their lifetime value to the nonprofit goes up by 50%. And so that's as simple as having a sort of rapid response donor acknowledgement committee. And anytime you get a gift over a certain amount, the staff will send out an email saying, hey guys, we just got $1,000 from John Doe. Can anybody call him to say thank you? And it's not an ask. It's not an invite. There's no call to action. It's just simply showing gratitude. And that's the kind of relationship building tactics that are really critical to drive fundraising performance.
yeah, I definitely agree with that. I love that example. And I think a lot of what I talk about in my own business is that fundraising is an inside job. And I just posted something on Instagram today about this. But with fundraising, we're all about relationships and we have to build an emotional connection in our appeals because people give from their emotional brains. But I've seen that organizations fail to do that internally. And something that you were saying earlier is we have all these big missions to change the world, but our mission it's outward. It doesn't necessarily relate to the inward. Our core values aren't in our inner culture. So I'd love to know if you have any specific actions or strategies that nonprofit leaders can implement to further enhance the emotional connection among their team members and foster an environment where everyone feels that their role is valued and supported in the fundraising efforts?
Yeah, I would say two things there, Haley. So, first of all, I think one of the biggest mistakes I see many nonprofits make, and this relates back to the board discussion we were just having, is that they do not have a board that represents the community they serve,
Hmm.
right? Only 8% of the 1.8 million nonprofits in the country have a board member under the age of 50. And how many youth services groups are out there? If you're working with the LGBT community and you're not representing that perspective at the leadership level on your board, or working with gender equality or racial populations or the homeless or whatever it might be, having that lived experience, so it's not an ivory tower type approach, is absolutely critical. And I find that finds its way through the organization. But the other thing I wanted to mention is I do think there's a sort of a fork in the road, and there's not too many things you could say about all fundraising. But if I back it up, I would actually take issue with the comment that you made that people give with their emotional brains, because I think that's largely true for individuals, right? Major gifts and grassroots donations. And that's about their emotional brain, their connection to the cause on a personal level, and especially the personal relationship with the person making the ask or that connected them. But I've done a lot of work on the institutional side of fundraising with foundations, companies, government grants. And what I find is it's a bit different in that landscape. And of course, there's still a bit of that emotional connection that's important, and the storytelling is critical. But as opposed to it being all about the relationship and that really compelling and emotional pitch, what I find is the most critical determinant of success in institutional giving is really about understanding the goals and objectives and outcomes that funder is looking to generate, because ultimately they're not giving away their own money and they're beholden to a board or a committee that they have to go report back to. And they've got a job. They've been told, we're looking for you to drive this kind of impact and these kinds of metrics and outcomes. And understanding what their job is and what their goals are, and helping them understand how you can help them achieve those. To me, that's the essence of successful institutional fundraising. And it's the consultative selling approach in the for-profit world.
Hey there, podcast family. If you're like me and deeply committed to improving your leadership skills and fostering better connections with your team, I've got something truly amazing to share with you. I'm proud to introduce the EMC Masterclass, something I talk about often as a certified trainer. It's an incredible program developed by the renowned Dr. Lola Gershfeld, an organizational psychologist and corporate emotional connection expert. You might remember her from a podcast episode where she shared invaluable insights into the world of emotional connection. Dr. Gershfeld's EMC Leaders courses are designed for anyone working with people, whether you're a manager, supervisor, team leader, educator, coach, mentor, or a team member. This program is truly for everyone looking to enhance their communication and collaboration skills to raise more revenue for their mission. Now, let me tell you why the EMC Masterclass is a game changer. Dr. Gershfeld's groundbreaking emotional connection process has been integrated into top universities' curriculum and recognized by international organizations like ICF, HRCI, and SHRM. Humans are wired to seek emotional safety, and when we feel safe, we're more likely to take risks, share innovative ideas, and collaborate effectively. The EMC process is the catalyst for creating that emotional safety within your team. The virtual EMC Masterclass consists of 8 modules with 4 hours of expertly recorded material, 13 quizzes to reinforce your learning, and a workbook filled with activities for offline practice and something I still refer to daily. Ready to become an emotional connection master? Dr. Gershfeld is offering an exclusive detail for our podcast listeners. Use the code LEADWITHHEART to enjoy a generous 10% discount on the EMC Masterclass. Head over to emcleaders.com and enroll in the EMC Masterclass today. Yeah, definitely. And I like both of those points that you made, but I want to talk a little bit more about that board diversity, because how do you, obviously people have seen a shift in the last couple of years, and it should have been forever, but having more representation on their board of the people that they're serving, the community that they're representing. But a lot of what I found is that person ends up being on the board because they need that person on the board, but not really having that built-in buy-in and belonging. So how do you coach boards to really, there's diversity, equity, and inclusion. Diversity is obviously one aspect of that, but how do you coach boards to really build that inclusive environment where people feel valued, they feel like they belong at the table? Yeah.
Yeah, I think ultimately nothing's going to replace good leadership. And whether it's the board chair that's not making sure all voices are heard or the CEO that isn't paying attention to some of these considerations, that's always going to be a problem. From a structural standpoint, though, one of the types of scaffolding that are most helpful here, I mentioned the board member agreement before, and that is really helpful to get the entire board on the same page to just basically say, what is our highest and best purpose? And what is the minimum sets of roles and responsibilities that we all believe we should be providing and performing on an annual basis, whether that has to do with fundraising or other aspects of their leadership. And so setting that bar that is equitably applied to all directors is a really important starting point. Then there's this idea of inviting intentionality that I mentioned before, and that's where the board matrix typically comes into play. And unlike the more robust matrices that are trying to track everything, and it's like a census that you might need when you're applying for a grant, again, from a management tool standpoint, what I find to be most helpful is paring it back, just like with all these tools, to really the must-have critical determinants and really trying to identify 15 to 20 characteristics where it's like, it would be impossible for us to fulfill our potential and meet our mission unless we had each and every one of these things represented somewhere on the board in the next decade, let's say. And I think in the context of that, when the template that I can offer lays this out, there's a strong look at expertise and capacity. We need nonprofit fundraising and governance experience, legal, accounting. We're a food security organization, so we want expertise in that field. Development, if we're about to do a capital campaign, whatever it might be. But also on the capacity side, time and money. We want some folks with more time on their hands. Always nice to have a few high net worth folks that could write a big check if they're so inclined. Then there's the connections piece. And obviously we need a lot of inroads through our board. And so let's be explicit about what kinds of connections to partners, to funders, et cetera. But that diversity piece is the third piece. And rather than just looking at it from a perspective of race and ethnicity, to me, it's, as I said earlier, about representing the community you serve. So that includes race and gender. It includes sexual orientation. It includes geography, age, anything that relates to lived experience. And when you look at it through that lens, I think it really helps to validate the importance of it. But again, this is the tool to help you make sure that representation is there. From a standpoint of engagement, that's about leadership. And these tools, like I said, can provide the scaffolding. So now we have a clearing to actually have a board meeting about moving the organization forward instead of just bringing you up to speed. But navigating through that really requires astute leadership from both the CEO as well as from the board chair.
Yes, I love that. Thank you so much for sharing that foundational scaffolding and kind of the how people can navigate that. One other thing that I wanted to touch on was based on your bio, you lead organizations, you assume leadership roles when launching new initiatives.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd love to know a little bit more about how you navigate that as a leader and how you bring alongside people to help launch those initiatives.
Yeah, so I've done this in a couple different instances. Craigslist Foundation wasn't new, but it was dormant and hadn't even had a board meeting for 2 years when I took the reins there. I also ran the foundation for Numi Organic Tea for the last 8 years. And I started a project called Gender Smart, which is now called 2X Global, focused on getting more money into women-led businesses and businesses that serve women and girls. And in each of those cases, part of what made them successful was I once had the opportunity to hear former President Bill Clinton speak. And one of the things he said that really stuck with me was seek first to collaborate and only then to lead. Seek first to collaborate. And so for me, it's about starting out with deep listening and really making sure that you're in tune with what is the vision? Who else is out there? How are we different? Or how are we collaborating? What's needed and what's missing? So that when you come up with your solution, when you come up with your plan, it's rooted in that landscape and making a non-duplicative contribution and moving the field forward. And so I think when you approach things with perspective of service. In Sanskrit, the word is seva, which is about selfless service. It starts with seeing who else is out there and what you can do. And I think for me, that's the most important thing. And then as a fundraiser, like my mind immediately jumps to, okay, where's the money? Where's the fertile ground that is going to provide the resources to fuel this mission, right? And starting to talk to some of those folks and being comfortable sharing an idea when it's still a little half-baked, getting their input. Like I said, you want money, ask for advice, right? And so trying to talk to some of those potential supporters and enlisting their help at the ground floor so that once you are able to come back with a package and say, we heard you and we have built an organization that has taken that into account. Here's where we landed. That sense of ownership transfers and the resources likely transfer too. And once you've got that mission that is rooted in an ecosystem view and line of sight on some resources, now those tend to be the biggest limiting factors when you're in the early stages trying to get something off the ground.
Oh, that's so good. Thank you so much for sharing that and your insight into how you launch new initiatives and really get that buy-in from people. And yes, I've heard advice, get money thing, and I've seen it work in my own career. Getting people's buy-in has paid off dividends. As we wrap up, is there any other advice that you would give to maybe an emerging leader that might be listening to this podcast on how they can navigate some of the things that we talked about?
Yeah, I think I would circle back to that notion of seek first to collaborate and only then to lead, especially like if you're like me, where you're a transplant from the for-profit world. I've seen a lot of folks show up with this sort of I've got all the answers mentality. And it's great that you're passionate. It's great that you're here. We want you. We need your leadership and your contribution. But take the time to really survey the landscape first and see how you can add to it. I think that's critical. And the other thing to remember is that you're too talented to be unhappy. And so if you're not in a functional environment, if you're not in an atmosphere where you feel like you're giving your best stuff and you're doing your best work, then that's probably a huge red flag that there's something wrong. And whether it's about needing to look at a different mission or a different organization or a different team, we need people fulfilled and self-realized. And if you're in this field, that means you're at the top of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And so that should feel really good. And if it doesn't, I would take a long, hard look at why and decide what you need to change in order to get there.
Ooh, that's a good way to end. I have two more questions. One question is, I always like to ask this, what is lighting you up or bringing you joy right now?
I'm a new dad. My son is about to turn 7. And so that has been just a phenomenal experience. I've done a lot of work with youth over the years and just getting to put into practice a lot of the things that I've talked to other folks about and seeing it in my own family has just been incredibly beautiful to see it unfold.
Oh, that's so sweet. I love that. And where can people find you?
My website is at helpingpeoplehelp.com. And as I do, anytime I do a podcast interview or a keynote or write books, I'm happy to offer up a pro bono coaching session to any of your listeners. So if they want to reach out to me and get in touch with their website, I'm happy to jump on a call for 15, 20 minutes, find out a little bit more about their struggles, their organization, and just point them to some resources and best practices if that's helpful.
Amazing. Thank you so much for offering that. I know after people have listened to this podcast, I'm sure they'll have lots of questions on how to navigate it in their own individual situation. Well, thank you so much, Darian, for taking this time to talk to me. Again, this was a pinch me moment and it's just been such a joy to learn from you.
Well, thanks, Haley. I appreciate you having me and I appreciate your audience tuning in. And I want to thank them not only on behalf of myself and on behalf of the podcast, but on behalf of the thousands of people they collectively serve. It's been a privilege. Hope this was helpful.
If you have valued these stories or learned something from what you've heard, please share this podcast episode or follow me on LinkedIn. Thank you so much for your support, and together we can build a better community and world.